This is the guy I call the railroad detective. He was one of the shooters from the overpass. There was another one associated with the storm drain area under where the police officer is there. I already have a video up about that. I've made videos about the railroad detective before, but I don't have one up now. So that's what this is. This is my railroad detective video. As far as I can tell, he fired 2 shots. One can be seen in frame 322 of the Zapruder film, and another one in frame 330, very close together. And they can be seen because there's a stream, apparently, of glass dust or glass pieces created by the bullet coming through the windshield. People will argue this is a reflection off the windshield, but that's impossible because to be a reflection off the windshield, it has to be coming from the windshield, not from behind the windshield. The part behind the windshield cannot be a reflection off the windshield. It has to be a reflection off something behind the windshield. And the only thing that makes sense to me is it's glass dust coming from the windshield following a bullet that has already passed through. And this is frame 322 here, where you can see there's that stream of reflecting material behind the windshield. You can see, and you might have to study it, but you can see that something is coming out of John Connally's wrist, and we know that he was shot in the wrist. And then something seems to be bouncing off JFK's chest. What I think is that the bullet shattered in Connally's wrist and perhaps brought some bone fragments with it to JFK, and what we're seeing there is material bouncing off his chest. And the other frame after this where there's a shot, I don't see that it hit anybody. But this one, I think very clearly, upon study, hit John Connally in the wrist and JFK in the chest. And it came from the guy that I call the railroad detective. And here, in a frame from the Wiegman film, circled in yellow, is an apparent cloud of smoke. Now, people will argue endlessly about modern gunpowder not producing smoke, and it depends how the light hits this, whether it gets highlighted like this. I think we happen to be lucky here that the sun is hitting it a certain way and we can see it. I don't think it's really as dense a cloud as it might seem in this photograph or this frame of the film, but it's there, and if you study it, the edges have what look like little pieces that came out quicker than the smoke, what you would expect from a muzzle flash. It has moved away from the person. It's blowing away, I think, in the wind here. The wind was blowing northerly. Well, it was blowing in different directions, but it seems to be blowing northerly, and when you look at Jean Hill's dress and all. And circled in red there is where the railroad detective stands. So that cloud of smoke has just blown away from the railroad detective here as the presidential limousine starts to head under the overpass. And this is the cab look photo showing the railroad detective there. And this is a detail of that. And we've got Clyde Haygood, the police officer, on the right, and the railroad detective on the left. And my interpretation of this photography is that the railroad detective is holding a walkie-talkie and speaking into it at this time, and that he has a rifle there, business end down, and the rifle butt up, and the bottom of the rifle butt pointing away from him. And you can even see, it's just a hint really, but it's the sling of the rifle that he apparently is holding with his right hand. We can see the sling going up to the top of the rifle butt. Now, there will be people who will argue that it could be a shotgun. And yes, of course, it could be a shotgun. But I think it was a rifle because somebody did fire with a rifle from the overpass and the shots that we just reviewed from the Zapruder film. So I think it's a rifle. There was one person years ago when I made a video who argued that that looks too long to be a rifle based upon how high it comes up on the person. But I pointed out to him, and he agreed that the base of the banister there is elevated off the ground, and if he had the end of the rifle resting on that base, then it would be at the proper height to be a rifle. So I'd say that's what it is. Now, the walkie-talkie is significant for at least one reason, and that is that dark-complected man apparently is also talking on a walkie-talkie. And he's also, at that time he's talking on the walkie-talkie, he's looking up to the overpass, to the area where the railroad detective, is standing on the overpass. So I think probably that they had been talking to each other. Whether or not they're talking to each other when we see the railroad man or not, he might be talking to somebody else that time, because the two photographs are not simultaneous. Here in a wider angle on the dark-complected man when he's talking on the walkie-talkie, and this is from a Towner slide, we can see in the foreground the motorcycle officer there. That's Clyde Haygood. So obviously dark-complected man is talking on his walkie-talkie before we see the railroad detective talking on his. So he could still be talking to dark-complected man at this time, or he could be talking to somebody else. And I don't know who did this. I don't know who to credit. It looks like it came from some published work, whether a book or a magazine. But somebody has done some drawing on the right to emphasize what looks like the man talking on a walkie-talkie, dark-complected man. And another photograph, you see dark-complected man walking on the sidewalk, and it looks like he probably has that walkie-talkie in his back pocket. And just in case you didn't know, dark-complected man signaled the throat shot which came from the storm drain-associated overpass shooter. And here in the Willis 5 photo, you can see the scene just before that shot is fired, or maybe just as it's fired. I think it's just slightly before it's fired, with dark-complected man having his right hand to his walkie-talkie, which I take to be under his jacket there, based upon the telegraphed bulges you can see through his jacket. And the point of this shot, of course, was to disguise JFK's reaction to John Connally's poison shot by making him react to a rifle shot to the throat. So the railroad detective on the overpass is working with the assassins who talk to each other with the walkie-talkies. And well, let's not get too far off the topic. Let's just say he's one of the assassination crew. And the reason I call him the railroad detective is that Clyde Haygood told Mr. Bellin of the Warren Commission that that's who he talked to in the railroad yard. And this is part of the railroad yard, the overpass. Did you talk to any people over there or not? In the railroad yard, I talked to one of I presumed to be a railroad detective that was in the yard. Had he been in the yard before or not? No, he was just coming into the area after I was. I think that's a lie. He was coming into the area after the shooting? Yes. Did he say anything to you that you remember? Nothing that I remember. Well, so, given the circumstances here, a man standing apparently with a rifle, talking on a walkie-talkie with Clyde Haygood looking right at him, I think this must be the guy he's talking about when he says he talked to a railroad detective. And I think he was probably instructed by somebody to mislead on that point. That is to say, this guy just came into the area afterwards. But if that's not the railroad detective he's talking about, then why doesn't he mention him? Obviously, at the time anyway, he thinks this is a person of significance. So I think this is the railroad detective that Clyde Haygood was talking about. And here in a latter-day interview, Clyde Haygood remembers the railroad detective again and says there was nothing else in the yard.
There's a lot of people was looking and pointing up at Triple Underpass. The only person that I seen that I recognized as being a railroad detective. There was nothing else in the yard.
So I think this guy with the rifle and the walkie-talkie is Clyde Haygood's railroad detective. And while I can't be sure, I think probably Sam Holland saw this guy too. Here, Mr. Stern of the Warren Commission asks, and these policemen that you spoke to, there were 3 altogether? Two, there were two city policemen and one man in plainclothes. I didn't talk to him. I talked to the city policeman. You don't know what his affiliation was? I know he was a plainclothes detective or FBI agent or something like that, but I don't know, and I told him I would be back, and after lunch I would go up there. He had been asked to help them to identify railroad workers so they could only allow railroad workers on the overpass. Now, I'm not sure it's the same guy, but I think probably it is. Now, some people will complain that if this guy had fired, then these people standing right there would have seen him and heard him, and I have no doubt that that's true. But these people are not identified anywhere, and it's not even acknowledged that they exist anywhere except in the photography. They don't look like railroad workers. I don't know who they are. They look like they probably are black people. And in Dallas, perhaps black people could be easily controlled. And there were also some railroad workers standing on the bridge over Elm Street, as you can see here in the Alkin 7 photograph. And people will complain that if somebody was firing from the position of the railroad detective, that these people would have seen him. But if we examine the geography or the geometry or whatever of the place, notice I've worked out where those railroad workers were standing. Where the black folks are standing is the blue dot, and the railroad detective is the red dot. Now notice that the bridge veers off to the side here when it gets to the corner and is no longer over the street. And I've circled in orange two pillars that go higher than the rest of the structure. And this is a photograph taken by Christopher Smith, I believe. At the time I grabbed this, I asked him for permission to use it in a video, and he happily granted me permission. I didn't ask him for this video, but I'm just assuming he still doesn't mind. And you can see this is about from the position of where the railroad workers were standing. And where the bridge veers off to the right there, you can't see where the railroad detective would be standing because this pillar is in the way. So I think probably where the railroad workers were standing, you wouldn't have been able to see the railroad detective firing. Of course, you would have been able to hear it, but with all the excitement and commotion and the fact that the barrel is pointed away from them, perhaps they didn't notice. There is only one person on the overpass that we know of, that we have identified, that we know the name of, who arguably could have seen the railroad detective shooting from where he was stationed on the west side of the overpass. He should have had a clear view, and that is James C. White, Patrolman White. But White told the FBI and the Warren Commission that he didn't witness the assassination because a freight train passed moving in a southerly direction and blocked his view of the east side of the overpass. So he's saying that there was a freight train going across the overpass at the time of the assassination. That's not true, according to the photography. There's no freight train moving over the overpass. But whether it's true or not, he said it was true, and therefore, according to his story, he wouldn't have been able to see the railroad detective firing. In fact, he wouldn't have been able to hear him either, according to his story, because it was a noisy freight train and he didn't hear any shots. And while I can't be certain, I think it's the same person who goes and stands in front of the school book depository for a while, first on one side and then on the other. He looks like he's some kind of official detective, but he never goes in the building, so I think that makes sense with the interpretation that he's a railroad detective. And in all the years I've been interested, I haven't been able to find out any name of any railroad detective. This is very weird. We've got this guy who obviously was involved. He's in Dealey Plaza. He's standing right there. He would be identifiable to anybody who knew him. But I haven't found any identification of him at all, except what we hear from Clyde Haygood. And so that's why I think he's a railroad detective.